There is a name that some families still carry, quietly, without ceremony, that once belonged to emperors. Not a legend, not a myth passed down at dinner tables. An actual surname, still listed on passports and gravestones, that once sat at the top of the most powerful empire in the medieval world. For centuries, nobody thought much of it. A surname was just a surname, inherited, administrative, sometimes accidental. Then genetic genealogists started looking closer, and what they found did not confirm the old assumption. It complicated it, because some of these rare names, Paleologos, Cantacuzzinos, Comninos, Daucas, were not common peasant surnames that evolved randomly over 1,000 years. They were dynastic names, ruling names, the kind of names that, in Byzantine history, meant you controlled armies, married into thrones, or sat in Constantinople issuing decrees that shaped the medieval Mediterranean. So the question became unavoidable. If a family today carries one of these names, does that mean something real survived? A bloodline, a Y chromosome, a direct genetic thread stretching back to the fall of Byzantium? Or is the name simply an echo, a borrowed prestige with no biological truth behind it at all? This is the story of 13 rare Greek surnames, the dynasties they came from, and what DNA testing has actually revealed when researchers tried to answer that question. The results were not simple, and in some cases, they were stranger than anyone expected. For most of history, surnames in Greece were not treated the way we treat them now. In many rural regions, hereditary family names only stabilized in the last 2 or 3 centuries. Before that, people were often known by their father's first name, their village, or a nickname that stuck for a generation and then vanished. But Byzantine aristocratic families were different. Long before common surnames existed, the empire's ruling houses had already built dynastic names that functioned almost like brands: Comninos, Daucas, Angelos, Paleologos. These were not humble patronymics. They were political identities, passed down through marriage alliances and inherited titles, sometimes combined into double-barreled names to signal that a person belonged to 2 great houses at once. When Constantinople fell in 1453, these families did not disappear. Some fled to Italy, Russia, and the Ionian Islands. Some stayed under Ottoman rule and faded into the general population. Over the following centuries, their names spread, sometimes carried by direct descendants, sometimes adopted by unrelated families who admired the prestige, and sometimes granted informally to loyal servants or godchildren, a practice that was not unusual in the era. That is the accepted history. A dynasty falls. Its name scatters. Some who carry it today are descendants. Others simply inherited the label. For a long time, that was considered the end of the conversation. A surname was cultural, not biological. Case closed. Except it wasn't, not entirely. Because when small clusters of families carrying these rare names were examined more closely, not through legend, but through parish records, migration patterns, and eventually genetic testing, something did not fit neatly into the just a borrowed name explanation either. In certain isolated communities, particularly in the Peloponnese and parts of the Ionian Islands, families carrying these dynastic surnames had stayed remarkably concentrated. They intermarried within small regional networks for generations. Village records showed the same rare names appearing again and again, in places with direct historical ties to where those Byzantine families were last documented living, fighting, or hiding after 1453. That alone was not proof of anything. Geography and coincidence can explain a lot. But it raised a question historians could not fully answer using paper records alone. Were these communities preserving a real biological line, or just a name that had settled into a region and stayed there through cultural inheritance? To go further, researchers needed something paper trails could not offer. They needed the genome itself. This is where Y chromosome DNA became central to the story. The Y chromosome passes almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, accumulating only small mutations over centuries. Because most traditional surname systems, including the Byzantine aristocratic ones, followed the male line, geneticists realized that Y DNA offered something unusually powerful here. If a surname had been passed down through an unbroken male line for 500 years, the men carrying it today should, in theory, share a detectable genetic signature. This is the same logic used in well-known surname studies among European noble houses, where genetic genealogists compare Y chromosome markers across men who share a historical name, looking for a shared ancestral signal, what researchers often call a genetic cluster, instead of relying on documents alone. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where genealogy and genetics intersect, let me know in the comments which lineage or population I should investigate next. When genetic genealogists began applying this method to rare Byzantine-derived surnames, they were not expecting a clean answer. And they did not get one. Some men carrying names like Komnenos or Paleologos showed Y-DNA haplogroups consistent with populations that had been present in the eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia for thousands of years, plausible, though not conclusive, for a lineage with deep regional roots. Others carrying the exact same surname showed haplogroups far more common in completely different regions, patterns that did not point toward the Byzantine heartland at all. In other words, two men with an identical, rare, historically loaded surname could carry genetic signatures suggesting entirely different ancestral origins. That was not a contradiction researchers could quietly dismiss. It was a signal. And it meant the surname itself, no matter how prestigious or historically documented, could not be treated as a reliable genetic marker on its own. The story did not collapse into, the names are all fake. It widened into something more layered. Because within those mismatched results, certain smaller clusters did emerge, tight groups of men, often from the same regional pocket, sharing a Y-DNA profile closely enough that a common male ancestor within the historically relevant timeframe became a reasonable hypothesis, not just a hopeful guess. So now the investigation had two questions instead of one. Why did some name carriers share genuine genetic continuity, while others clearly did not? And for the ones who did show a real shared signal, how far back did that connection actually reach? At this point, three explanations became the leading frameworks researchers used to make sense of the pattern. The first is direct patrilineal descent, a genuine, unbroken male line stretching from a documented Byzantine noble household down to a family living today. This is the explanation the surname itself implies, and in a small number of tightly clustered cases, the genetic and geographic evidence lines up well enough to make it plausible. The second is adoptive or honorific naming, a practice where the surname was given, not inherited biologically. This happened historically through godparent naming traditions, through servants or retainers taking their patron's name, and through informal social prestige transfer during the chaotic centuries after the empire's fall. In these cases, the name is historically real, but the Y-DNA tells a completely unrelated ancestral story. The third, and perhaps the most quietly fascinating, is convergent adoption, separate, unrelated families independently choosing or acquiring the same prestigious dynastic name in different regions and different eras, with no biological link between them at all beyond a shared cultural gesture toward history. None of these explanations cancels out the others. That is the uncomfortable, honest core of this research. All three appear to be true simultaneously, distributed unevenly across different branches of the same surname. The most significant progress on this question has not come from a single dramatic discovery, but from the slow accumulation of broader genetic genealogy databases, larger sample sizes, more complete regional comparison panels, and, increasingly, ancient DNA extracted from burial sites connected to the medieval Eastern Mediterranean. As these datasets grew, researchers could finally compare living surname carriers not just against each other, but against genetic material recovered from the actual era in question. That comparison mattered more than anything that came before it, because it moved the question out of the realm of family legend and into something closer to a testable hypothesis. And what those broader comparisons increasingly suggested was not the tidy story either side of the debate wanted. It was not a triumphant confirmation that every Paleologos alive today descends from an emperor. Nor was it a flat dismissal that all such claims are cultural fiction. Here's the twist. Not the twist the skeptics expected, and not the twist the romantics expected either. In several of the tightest, most historically anchored regional clusters, small communities where the surname, the geography, and the oral tradition all pointed toward the same Byzantine-era origin. The Y-DNA signal did not simply confirm a straightforward Greek or Anatolian ancestral line. In a number of these cases, the genetic markers carried an unexpected secondary signal, one linked to population movement patterns associated with earlier medieval migrations into the Byzantine world, traces some researchers interpret as evidence of the empire's own internal diversity, where soldiers, administrators, and marriage alliances brought Armenian, Slavic, or Caucasian ancestry directly into aristocratic households centuries before the fall of Constantinople. The surprise was not that a name might be borrowed. The surprise was that even the genuine bloodlines were never as ethnically simple as the name implied. The Byzantine aristocracy itself was already a blend by the time these surnames were formed, a layered inheritance disguised by a single, elegant Greek name. Not a pure line preserved in secret for 1,000 years. Something closer to a mosaic, carrying pieces of a much larger and messier empire than any surname alone could ever announce. That finding matters far beyond 13 rare surnames. It reflects something true about almost every claim of unbroken ancestral prestige in any culture. Names are cultural inheritances first, biological ones second, if at all. The Byzantine Empire itself was never a single ethnic bloodline ruling over a single ethnic population. It was a vast, cosmopolitan structure built from Greek, Anatolian, Armenian, Slavic, and Caucasian threads, held together by language, faith, and administration rather than genetic purity. So when a family today carries the name Komnenos or Doukas, the honest answer to, does this prove descent from an emperor, is rarely a clean yes or no. It is closer to, this name carries a real historical weight, and in some documented cases a plausible genetic thread worth taking seriously, but the empire it came from was never as genetically singular as the name makes it sound, even for those with the strongest claim to it. Picture the Mani Peninsula in the southern Peloponnese, where some of these rare surnames still cluster today. Stone tower houses rise out of a dry, unforgiving landscape, built by families who, for centuries, defended their isolation fiercely enough that outsiders rarely settled among them. Wind moves through abandoned villages where the same handful of surnames appear on weathered gravestones, generation after generation, names that trace back through Ottoman-era tax records to the last documented movements of Byzantine noble refugees after 1453. It is easy to imagine, standing in that silence, that isolation preserved something pure. And in a narrow, technical sense, in a few of these communities, it may have preserved a genuine and traceable male line. But even here, the deeper genetic story insists on complexity. The mountains kept the name intact. They did not keep the bloodline simple. If a story like this pulls you toward the space where science and family history collide, subscribing helps, because there is far more hidden in the human past, and in the names we still carry, than most of us ever stop to ask about. What this investigation ultimately reveals is not a verdict on 13 surnames. It is a lesson about the limits of certainty itself, applied to something deeply personal, the name a person inherits and quietly wonders about. A surname can be true and incomplete at the same time. A bloodline can be real and still be woven from more threads than the name lets on. The old assumption, that a name either proves noble descent or proves nothing at all, was always too small for what actually happened across 1,000 years of empire, collapse, migration, and quiet survival. The genome does not settle the argument the way a headline wants it to. It does something more interesting. It shows that even the families who can trace a real, defensible line back toward Byzantium are not carrying a single pure inheritance. They are carrying the empire itself, layered, blended, unresolved, and far larger than any one dynasty's name could ever fully contain. The map of who these families really are is still being drawn. What the DNA has offered so far is not an ending. It is a far more honest beginning.